take you back to the live pictures from the Syrian capital, Damascus. It is early afternoon there, and we have seen throughout the last couple of hours small crowds gathering in the centre of the capital, appearing to celebrate Assad's ousting. They've been chanting, raising their fists. We've also seen them taking pictures because, of course, a lot of Syrians fled during the Assad regime to neighbouring countries, and a lot of people that have re-entered may well be sending those pictures back to their relatives and others in those other countries. We've seen long queues at the border, particularly in the border between Syria and Lebanon. Here you can see those live pictures of the cars and vehicles queuing up, trying to get back in to Syria after they fled during the Assad regime. Let us bring in our security correspondent, Frank Gardner, who has got so much expertise in this area. And I suppose, Frank, the big question and the hard question is what happens next?
There's going to be a really difficult balancing act for the leader of HTS. This is somebody who, up until now, has gone by the nom de guerre of Abu Muhammad al-Jawlani, but he wants to revert to his real name, which is Ahmed al-Shara, because he's trying to ditch his jihadist links. Well, he has ditched them largely, but he certainly wants to distance himself from that. The difficult balancing act is this. On the one hand, he needs to establish enough of a rule of law and enough discipline that there isn't more looting, dismantling of government infrastructure in the way that Iraq got ransacked after the 2003 US-led invasion. And he also needs to make sure that there isn't a bloodletting in some of the remoter parts of the country, people settling scores, which could simply reignite a civil war. Because remember that Syria is a patchwork of a lot of different ethnicities and religions. You've got the Sunni Muslims, Shia Muslims, Christians, Kurds, Alawites, and so on. And he's got to somehow balance all of these, at the same time being democratic enough that he makes his this country internationally acceptable. So far, I have to say the signs are very good. He's saying the right things. But let's not forget that, and I'm not saying that the two are in any way the same, but let's not forget that in 2021, when the Taliban took over Afghanistan and the West fled, they gave all sorts of promises about an inclusive government. And of course it wasn't, and it's turned into an open prison for women. But I think Syria has a brighter future than Afghanistan does.
And I suppose the nightmare is that it goes the way, say, for example, after Libya in the fall of Colonel Gaddafi, where we've seen endless civil war there.
Every time I see pictures in the Arab world, and I mean, I certainly don't count myself as an expert, but I've lived a lot of my adult life in the Arab world. And every time I see pictures of celebrating crowds, pulling down statues of former dictators, you think, yeah, but what follows? Because where you've got countries that have been very tightly controlled with a brutally repressive security service, countries like Libya, Syria, Iraq, Yemen, then it's incredibly difficult to keep a lid on that. And often it just spirals out of control. As you rightly say, you know, there was a relatively limited Western intervention in Libya. It was from the air, but it was enough to help topple Gaddafi. And he had held that country so tightly that it disintegrated into competing factions. And it's still that way today. You've got two different power centers, essentially. And Iraq, of course, the invasion was followed by years of chaos and terrorism and kidnapping. And it was a disaster. And Iraqis who didn't enjoy living under Saddam Hussein said, oh my God, life was better under him. At least we were safe. So this is going to be a real challenge now. And I think let's not forget the risk of Al-Qaeda and ISIS trying to take advantage of any kind of confusion and chaos. Up in the north of Syria, you've got a complicated situation here because Turkey doesn't like the Kurdish groups, and every now and then it bombs them. Those Kurdish groups, the SDF, the Syrian Democratic Forces, are guarding ISIS prison camps, camps that contain tens of thousands of really very dangerous, hardened jihadists. If safety breaks down there and the Kurds have to flee to defend themselves, then they will break out of those prisons and ISIS will be resurgent, not just in the Middle East, but across Europe. And that's a situation that the US is determined to try and stop happening.
You mentioned the US, you mentioned Turkey. How important are the international community going to be about events that come about in Syria now?
Well, Syria is not the West's problem in the way that Iraq and Afghanistan were, because the West intervened in those two countries disastrously, as it turned out. But in the case of Syria, it's been Russia, Iran, and Hezbollah that intervened to prop up the brutal regime of Bashar al-Assad, and Turkey that has supported the rebels. So they're going to be, certainly Turkey is going to, and Iran to some extent, but Turkey is going to be instrumental in trying to calm the situation. And I think there's going to be quite a lot of US pressure on Turkey not to bully the Kurds so much that they lose control over those camps that I've mentioned. But international support is going to be really important. I think one of the key things here is how quickly the terrorism nomenclature can be dropped from HTS, which is the main rebel group, that's Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, because it split from al-Qaeda back in 2016. There's no question it was linked to al-Qaeda, and it was even linked to Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, who was the founder of ISIS, of so-called Islamic State, a man who died in airstrikes. But they have gone to great lengths to distance themselves from that. And I think if they can prove that they are going to oversee a transition to a genuinely inclusive government that is broadly democratic, this will be a new dawn for Syria. And this is what everybody's hoping for. But there's all sorts of pitfalls along the way. And there are some hardcore, excuse me, there are some hardcore, very intolerant people within the ranks of the rebel groups. Remember that they have been bottled up in Idlib in the northwest of Syria for quite a long time. They've had to deal with quite a lot of discipline issues there. They don't have a great reputation for respect for human rights. So now they're going to have to prove themselves.